Welcome to Canada's Dark Past, a CityNews Special investigation into the ongoing trauma caused by the residential school system. Now, this month marks 3 years since the discovery of potential burial sites at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. In the months and years since, more Indigenous communities across BC and Canada have conducted their own investigations and shared similar findings. Now, most recently, the Stilatin First Nation and the Nadlay Wutan Indian Band began their own search for potential unmarked graves at the former Lejack Indian Residential School in northern BC. The findings, however, are not new and instead confirm what residential school survivors have long known and reported, that many children who were forced to attend residential schools never returned home. In May 2021, the Kamloops Residential announced that they had found 200 potential unmarked graves at the site of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, which ran from 1890 to 1969. Now, enrollment at that school peaked in the early 1950s with about 500 students, according to the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, or NCTR. In 1969, the federal government took over and operated it as a residence for students attending local day schools. It closed in 1976. The Kamloops Indian Residential School was one of more than 130 that operated across the country. Since the 1880s, more than 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were taken from their families and communities to attend residential schools that were funded by the Canadian government and operated by churches. These schools were designed to separate the more than 150,000 children from their families and cultures, according to the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, or NCTR. Now, Canada has a long-running history of policies and practices to assimilate Indigenous people and eradicate their culture. Here is the timeline of notable events. In 1831, Canada opens its first residential school, the Mohawk Indian Residential School in Brantford, Ontario. In the year 1876, the Indian Act is enacted, giving government the exclusive right to create legislation regarding Indians and Indian lands. In 1920, the Indian Act makes attendance at residential schools compulsory for treaty status children between 7 and 15 years old. Now, the tide turns with the establishment of the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples in 1991. The commission aims to restore relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. The RCAP releases a report in 1996 calling for a public inquiry into the effects of residential schools on generations of Indigenous people. Now, that same year, the last residential school closes in Canada. Gordon Reserve Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan is demolished and destroyed. A near decade later, in 2007, implementation of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement begins. It follows the class action lawsuit lodged against the Government of Canada by survivors of residential schools. And a year later, in 2008, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada is established. That same year, Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologizes to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis for the residential school system. Now, progress would halt in 2021 with the discovery of 200 potential unmarked graves at the site of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia. The reality of the dark past of residential schools in Canada makes international headlines. Indigenous circles say it's an open secret that many have been calling to address and confirm for years. It is the beginning of a nationwide search for burial sites at residential schools. And according to estimates by the NCTR, more than 4,100 children died while attending these schools, up to about 6,000, according to the former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, experts warn that those numbers could climb with ongoing explorations of potential grave sites around the country. Coming up on Canada's Dark Past, a CityNews Special investigation into the ongoing trauma of residential schools. Regional Chief of the BC Assembly of First Nations, Terry Teegee, joins Adrian South in studio to talk about the discovery of potential burial sites at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School and the work that has followed in the 3 years since. But up next, a touching and heartbreaking interview with Tsleil-Waututh Nation elder Jean Gus, a survivor of St. Paul's Residential School in North Vancouver. Now, the trauma sustained from attending residential schools has a lasting impact on survivors and their families. No one knows this better than Tsleil-Waututh Nation elder Gene Gust. Now, his father and grandparents attended residential schools and suffered horrific abuse. Tales so bad that his father took those secrets to his grave. In an effort to protect their son from the same trauma, they sent Gene to a day school in North Vancouver. But in a tragic and not surprising turn of events, Gene would return home each day to the safety of his family's arms, but he'd return with a bleeding back and scars that would last a lifetime.
I just remember walking into that classroom for the very first time and seeing that teacher. She singled me out right away, and started abusing me, physically and emotionally and everything, and, calling me a filthy little Indian and all kinds of names. And she would deny me the right to even go to the washroom. And so, and then sometimes I'd have an accident, because I couldn't go, and then she would drag me up to the front of the class in front of all the students, and she'd bring out that yardstick with that little edge, and she'd start whipping me. And
now, Gene's teachers would actually hold him back after school, making him miss the bus and forcing him to walk along this very highway, a walk that would take hours upon hours for him to get home.
And so, things happened to me on my way home because there was a lot of predators out there. And so, I went through, the sexual abuses on my way home, a couple times. And after that, I quit walking home when they would do that to me. I would go down onto the mission reserve because I had an auntie and uncle a lot of aunties and uncles down there. But, one auntie and uncle, I would go to their place and stay there for sometimes months at a time. I wouldn't even go home until I knew I was safe. And
did you ever have an opportunity to maybe share with your parents what was happening to you in day school and during these walks?
I remember them saying once, oh no, they wouldn't do that to you. And so after that, I just learned, not to even talk about it. And so I just started shoving everything down inside of me, and that's what led to, me growing up, with all that buried inside of me there, becoming an angry young man, and falling into the alcoholism and the drugs at a very, very young age.
In your community, when people used to drink alcohol, it in a way allowed them to kind of share some of the trauma, some of the abuse they endured in residential schools, some of these stories that maybe they wouldn't be comfortable sharing if they weren't drinking this alcohol. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there's some of them, my older cousins, they shared, because they went to the residential schools, and a lot of the boys and girls, with all the sexual abuses and everything that they went through, when the boys would fight back, the priest would pull all their teeth out, with a pair of pliers with no kind of, anesthetics or anything at all there. They would just rip all of their teeth out, because, I think the boys would bite when the priests were doing, their sexual abuse with them there, and so if they bit, then they would pull all their teeth out.
I'm sure there's a lot of anger within a lot of people within Indigenous communities due to the residential school system. What happens after experiencing this? What happens to the community?
Some of them would talk when we would be drinking. They'd start sharing some things with me, and so it just led to a lot of alcoholism, abuse, and some of them never ever could recover from it, and they went at very young ages in their life, way sooner than they should have.
And can you share with us some of the important work you're doing with the Indian Residential School Survivor Society?
I got started helping the people, and some of the stories that I heard of the people that I help, I do all different kinds of ceremonies with them. I brush them mainly with a cedar balls or smudge them, and then I listen to them. I let them talk, when they're comfortable, when they feel okay in here to talk with me. And when they share their stories, it's sometimes so heartbreaking, but, I try to remain strong inside for them and for spirit so I can help them.
And Gene, how did members of your community work towards healing after all of these atrocities done to them?
A lot of my relatives, Sundance and do the sweat lodges as well there, and some even powwow dance, and going to the mountains and, standing under the cedar trees or by the water, or, getting into the water and having a sacred bath, all of those things, when you're there, you pray and pray really hard, to let go of those things that, they do not belong to our people, all of that.
Now, sadly, Jean's story is just one of thousands. It is estimated that over 150,000 First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children attended residential schools. Now, some made it home, and we know over 4,000 children never did. Residential school survivors continue to be vocal about their lasting trauma and the ongoing impacts of intergenerational trauma. If you or someone you know has been impacted by residential schools, you can reach out to the Indian Residential School Survivors Society. Now, stay tuned. Canada's Dark Past, a CityNews Special investigation into the ongoing trauma of residential schools continues next. Over 130 residential schools operated in Canada between 1831 and 1996. 18 of those schools were here in BC. St. Mary's was the first to open in Mission in 1867, and it was the last to close in 1984. Now, since the discovery in Kamloops, more unmarked graves were found across the province. In June 2021, the Lower Kootenay Band said ground-penetrating radar found over 180 potential grave sites at the former St. Eugene's Mission School near Cranbrook. Now, that July, the Penelakut tribe announced over 160 undocumented graves at the former Cooper Island Industrial School. The next year, in January, indications of over 90 burial sites were found around the former St. Joseph's Mission near Williams Lake. The following year, in February, 17 suspected grave sites were detected around the former Alberni Indian Residential School on Vancouver Island. And in between were discoveries in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec. Now, estimates by the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation and the Truth and Reconciliation Committee suggest that between 4,000 to 6,000 children died while being forced to attend these schools. But many experts agree that there could be even more. Now, these discoveries were prompted by the tireless work of Indigenous leaders and their communities. Among them is Terry Teegee, Regional Chief with the BC Assembly of First Nations. Teegee has been supporting First Nations with stewarding residential school sites and advocating for ongoing support from the provincial and federal governments to continue searching for burial sites. The Regional Chief joins our reporter Adrian in studio now.
Thank you, Nima. Joining me now via Skype from Prince George, BC is Regional Chief Terry Teegee. Welcome, Terry. It's been 3 years since the Kamloops discovery. How are you today, and what's on your mind as we reflect on these findings?
Well, I think it's what I'm reminded of is all the children that never came home from, many of these institutions, many of these so-called residential schools. Also thinking about many of those, what we call caretaker communities that are looking after many of these sites and are also searching for many of those children that never made it home from these institutions.
And obviously people are aware of Kamloops and what happened, but could you walk me through the work that was being done that eventually led to the discovery in Kamloops?
Well, for many, many years, there were stories about children that never made it home, but also children that were used to dig some of these graves. And we heard about these stories, and I heard it from many of my uncles, many of previous generations, and also some of the survivors from residential schools. And from that, in Kamloops, what I understand is that for years, they looked at some of these sites, and during that time, over many years, they found enough funding and resources to start searching these areas. And also further to that was using ground-penetrating devices to search those areas, and that is what was found 3 years ago.
Could you talk about the prevalence of these burial sites, and how many do you think we expect to find in BC?
The potential, I'm not sure. But at the same time, some of these residential schools or these institutions also had incinerators. So there could be potential not finding any remains of children that have gone missing. So this is another thing that, some of the caretakers and some of the First Nations in this province are looking for is accurate files, accurate, really, I think, statistics in regards to many of the children that did go to residential schools, and also to try to figure out where did these children end up.
What do you think the government needs to do to readdress the residential school legacy and help people heal from this intergenerational trauma that it's created?
I think it's one of those things where it was a wake-up call, and also too it was one of those issues where we are not done with. There's still a search of many of these residential schools, not only here in British Columbia but also Canada. I think what we need to see is that we're coming up to an end of 3 years. There was a 5-year commitment on some of the funding. We need more resources and more funding, continued funding for some of the searches, and also to deal with some of the issues of the long-lasting legacy of residential schools, which means dealing with mental health, addictions, and all these other issues that is an after effect of residential schools.
Thank you so much for joining us, Terry. That's Terry Teegee, Regional Chief with the BC Assembly of First Nations. Stay tuned. Canada's Dark Past, a City News Special investigation into the ongoing traumas of residential schools continues next.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued 94 calls to action in 2015, years before the Kamloops announced their discovery of potential unmarked graves. The calls are for all levels of government and sectors in society to address the legacy of residential schools and its impact on survivors and their families in areas of child welfare and education, language and culture, as well as health and justice for Indigenous people. They also include actions in line with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Yellowhead Institute, based in Toronto, has been putting together yearly reports on the implementation of these calls. As of 2023, the Institute found that 81 out of the 94 calls remain incomplete. That same year, no additional calls were implemented. Some say while they remain incomplete, work on these calls remain ongoing, and that for some of them, they may take years, even a generation, to implement. Because of the slow progress, however, the Institute said that it would no longer continue publishing these reports. Now, joining us to unpack these actions and whether we have been making any progress is Angela White, Executive Director of the Indian Residential School Survivors Society. Angela, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, I know you and your organization work on the front line with residential school survivors in BC. What has been the reaction among them so far in regards to government action to tackle the issue of reconciliation following residential schools?
I think the best way to describe it is they provide what they're able to in those moments. However, there is never enough to meet the needs of the communities that are asking for the healing that they need to happen in their lives. So quite honestly, with every, I think, nonprofit or any program that the government has, it's never enough.
Would you say that this discovery was sort of an open secret among Indigenous communities? Were they surprised following this discovery?
In all of our First Nations communities, this was not a secret. It was something that we always knew. It just was not talked about. When the Indian Residential School Survivors Society was first established, we were established to provide the supports to those survivors during their testimony at the adjudication hearings. So out of all those hearings, we would hear all of in atrocious detail the traumas that had happened to them, including those that were unalived at these schools.
And would you say this announcement provided that sort of confirmation, that acknowledgement that Indigenous communities kind of wanted after speaking about this issue for years?
That's a complicated question, and I don't think there's an easy way to answer that. But I think what we can do is that we were there to support those communities despite not having the full evidence of it except for the verbal accounts. And that we will never know the full truth and the full whereabouts of all these missing loved ones that didn't return home from school, that because there are so many ways that they were not buried on the grounds of the residential school. They were disposed of or buried on other outside of those boundaries.
We hear a lot of apologies, Angela. We hear apologies from the federal level, provincial level. Do these apologies make any difference to Indigenous communities?
What my late grandmothers used to say, as well as every other elder that I do talk to, apologies only mean something when there's action behind those words. If we're going to just apologize with empty statements, apologies mean nothing.
So, Angela, what does reconciliation look like for you?
Reconciliation really has to have the action behind it, that we have to get to those tough, difficult discussions on the ugly behind the history, that we have to be able to understand what that really means and how it has impacted. And until we can sit down and have these conversations in a real way without that competitiveness or denialism or anything else for that matter, reconciliation cannot happen until we get to the ugly truth.
Get to the ugly truth. Angela White, thank you so much for joining us today. May 27th marks the 3rd year anniversary since the discovery of potential burial sites at Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia. A dark day in Canada's history, confirming for First Nations, Métis and Inuit people what many of them already knew. For survivors, the impacts continue to reverberate, with records showing that the over 4,000 Indigenous children who were forced to attend residential schools never made it home. Now, if you or someone you know has been impacted by residential schools, support is available through the Indian Residential School Survivors Society. That concludes our City News Special, Canada's Dark Past, a special investigation into the ongoing impact of residential schools. Thank you for joining us. I'm Nima Rajan. Good night.